Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned, where this week we're going to dig deep into the future of food, farming and the systems that sustain us. We're turning our attention to a movement that's as promising as it is often misunderstood, regenerative agriculture. It's a term that's gaining traction in headlines and boardrooms alike, from global food brands to policy circles. But for many farmers on the ground, it can still feel more like a buzzword than a practical path forward. So what's it going to take to change that? To help us unpack this, we're joined today by Andrew Voisey, Chief Impact Officer at Soil Capital, an agronomic advisory and carbon payments platform working directly with farmers to make carbon farming financially viable. Andrew brings deep insight from the field, not just theory, but first-hand experience working with hundreds of European farmers. So whether you're a producer, a policymaker, or just someone who cares about where your food comes from and where it's going, this is a conversation you don't want to miss. Hi, Andrew, and welcome to the show. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your path to Soil Capital and exactly what it is that you do?
Hi, Felicia. Thanks so much for having me. It's a real privilege, and I'm pleased that you've created space for what I think is such an important conversation. Where have I come from? I mean, my entire career so far has been focused on how we can rewire our economic system so that we deliver solutions to the grand social and environmental challenges we all know about as a natural consequence of our commercial activity, not as a sort of byproduct. And I am doing that having trained in environmental and social science and having done a sort of applied masters in different parts of our economic system to look at how the system works. And then I spent the first decade of my career working in and around the financial system with the goal of helping big financial institutions drive the financial economy, to drive the real economy, to work in the way I just described. And at some point towards the top of that 10-year phase, I had the desire for multiple reasons to move a little bit closer to the real world impact that fundamentally motivates me. And the food and farming system is so fundamental to every part of our lives and frankly every social and environmental challenge we could probably name, that it felt natural to move into that. So I met Soil Capital at the time where Soil Capital was very focused on its boots on the ground advisory work, interacting directly with farmers from around the world, helping them to change how they farm. But the business was looking to transition its model to have a far greater impact within the system. And that's sort of where we met. And today my role with the business is as Chief Impact Officer, as you said, which puts me in a position where I'm spending most of my time thinking about how to magnify and optimize our impact on the ground in the real world with not just hundreds actually, but thousands of farmers across Europe.
So what I love about what you're doing with Soil Capital is this idea of connecting something like carbon sequestration, which we need in order to address climate change, with improving the economic reality of many farmers. Because our food system is obviously under an enormous amount of pressure. There are big changes in growing patterns. There's issues around supply chains. There's issues around how much people can get paid. So it seems like a really, really logical thing to connect regenerative agriculture and the food system and carbon markets and economic reality. But the problem is, while there's a lot of attention on it, I think a lot of people struggle to understand how it can help them. So what do you think is holding back the idea of regenerative agriculture from becoming a sort of mainstream approach to how we farm?
Yeah, I think another way of asking that question that I sometimes hear is, when you dig deep, pun intended, into what regenerative agriculture can mean for farmers, there's a lot to like. And there's a lot to like, not just for the farmers, but for the rest of us as well, in terms of not just climate impacts, but biodiversity benefits, flood mitigation, nutrient density of food, and so at some point someone says, well, if it's so great, why isn't everyone doing it?
Exactly.
And I think the way I look at this, having trained as a sort of systems thinker, is to evaluate, or said more simply, just to see modern industrial farming today as the consequence of a system that we've built. It's functioning because that system exists, which was designed after the Second World War, and we haven't changed that system. So everything that is happening now on the fringes of that system is pushing against all of the everyday forces and flows of commerce and finance and social reinforcing factors as well. So until we change that system, we won't get a different outcome. And that system, it's maybe worth a brief trot through that kind of historical journey. Obviously, Second World War, much of Europe almost came to its knees in terms of being able to feed itself. And certainly in the UK as an island, we had very real issues of self-sufficiency. And so post-war, the driving logic, quite understandably, was let's organize our agricultural systems so that we never have that problem again. We must maximize output. And through the war, we then actually had chemical engineering and mechanical engineering that came together in different ways. And we harnessed those new capabilities to serve that system goal and to cut through an awful lot of sort of history and probably minimize it far too blithely. Modern industrial agricultural system was born where every problem is solved with inputs or heavy machinery.
Right.
Nature is suppressed and output is maximized as with no real help from the natural world. Certainly not carbon in the soil, certainly not a thriving biodiverse farming system, ecosystem. And obviously I'm generalizing here, but it's that system which we're trying to break out of now, while not cutting off our nose to spite our face.
And that does make a lot of sense. I mean, one of the things that I think is so appealing about the idea of regenerative agriculture is this idea that over the last 80 years, what we've basically done is, and not just with agriculture, but within many different industrial sectors, we've just ignored the externalities of our behavior. So the cost to the economy of stripping soil of its nutrients or enabling fertilizer runoff or whatever it might be have just been managed by other parts of the system. So I think that makes a lot of sense to me when you put it in terms of the systems that we're operating within, that the industrialization of agriculture has meant mechanization and input-output balance or imbalance. So what is it that you're actually doing that's changing that?
So our boots on the ground experience was our first phase as Soil Capital of trying to change that. We were of the view at the time that if you brought together the right advice, the right knowledge and the right analytics for farmers, they could see that actually for them it would make sense and be possible to break out of that system. But what we realized was that model of change would only go so far, and the so far really wasn't that far, because asking a farmer to fundamentally change their operating system is inviting them to take on a load of risk. And we're talking about people and families and economic actors that don't typically have the financial resilience to take on a lot of risk. Said another way, these are typically very low margin businesses with not a lot of cash flow, and asking them to potentially risk a decline in yield for several years or expose themselves to pest problems that they don't have the tools to deal with anymore because they've committed to taking some of those tools off the table. That risk barrier is simply too much for the vast majority. And so we have stasis in the system. And so what we saw within that was that if we could bring a new financial revenue as an incentive to the table, it wouldn't necessarily in a strict P&L sense offset that risk, but it might act as a behavioral nudge to incentivize the next group of farmers who are perhaps most willing, most open to that change to take that step. And the more that do, the more others behind them get inspired to do the same because they see it's perhaps not as risky as they may think, or frankly, the risk equation has changed because others have worked out how to make it work. So what we're really trying to do as Soil Capital is work within the food system to make it in the best interests of the food and beverage sector, to pay farmers a bit more as a financial incentive for changing how they farm and producing different climate and nature benefits that ultimately we quantify and verify that have benefit for the sector and all of us at large.
It's part of I think a bigger conversation that's going on in the sustainability world about the fact that while we may all want everyone to do the right thing, whatever we believe the right thing to be, it's a position of privilege to be able to experiment with change and not worry about how you're going to feed the family at the end of the day. I'm a great believer in, if you identify risks for actors, individuals, and show them ways in which they can manage that risk and potentially grow their business and be more resilient in the face of the changes that we're looking at, then that becomes a natural next step. But you talk about making this connection between, the food and beverage industry and farmers. How do you go about making that connection, that financial connection? Is this through, you mentioned monitoring and verification, is it through particular changes in your own measurement? Is it through the use of the carbon markets? How does it actually work?
Yeah, so in very practical terms, we're collecting data from farmers about how they farm, hundreds of data points supplemented by third-party data that is monitoring their farm. And we're processing that through different calculators and models, some of them our own, some of them third parties, and turning what they're doing at farm level into quantified impact in terms of carbon emissions, soil carbon sequestration, but also improvements to soil health, improvements to farm biodiversity, improvements to water management, and putting those into single data packages that relate to the supply chains of the food and beverage companies that we work with. So from their point of view, these food and beverage companies are looking for that data that evidences positive impact within their own supply chains for different reasons, which we may come on to. But it's that data packet that we provide to them, which has value for them, that they pay for. And then we flow that value back to the farmers that have generated that positive impact in the first place. And you asked about carbon markets. I mean, we are building on, I would say, and borrowing from much of the best practice and the infrastructure in the voluntary carbon markets. But a lot of that infrastructure and best practice is organized around carbon offsetting, transactions between two entities that have otherwise no commercial relationship. And here we're talking about action within the value chain, scope 3 stuff. Some people call it insetting, which has different nuances. And so we're having to sort of work with different actors to evolve the right standards and infrastructure to serve that purpose as well.
So I think that makes it a very good time to actually explore why it is that this would be of benefit to the food and drink industry. And obviously, when you're talking about insetting and you're talking about improvements in the supply chain, you mentioned scope 3, there's obviously going to be issues around reporting, but what is driving action on the part of the sector itself?
Yeah, look, I think there is a topic around compliance and there is a topic around investor expectations, which lead to scope 3 targets and so on. And I know you've talked on this podcast about the waxing and waning of ESG and so on. So it's true, those things are somewhat transitory. We even see in the regulatory world at a European level, these various different omnibus processes, which are sort of the waning of regulatory expectations. But I think right at the heart of this, one of the things that makes me so excited and motivated about what we're doing is that actually for the food and beverage sector, what this is about is not just targets and other people's expectations. It's about fundamental resilience in their business and the ability to continue operating. There are now more and more regular examples of iconic food consumer products that go to market without one of their major ingredients because the harvests failed. I'm thinking there of McDonald's burgers in India without tomatoes. And that's a very kind of cut-through example where the lack of resilience in our food production system leads to a very clear consequence at the other end of the chain. But there's a more behind the scenes, but actually more, a more dangerous almost force happening, which is happening all the time now, where extreme weather is causing crop yields to be massively more volatile than they ever used to be because we don't have resilience in our farming systems. And that volatility, boom and bust, mainly bust, is leading to price spikes. And we now have academic confirmation that at some point during 2022, 2023, the single biggest driver of food price inflation in the UK was not energy, as we all might think, the cost of energy. It was extreme weather impacts on food production.
And that's extreme weather impacts in all of those places around the world where we source our food.
Yes, of course, because we're not anywhere near self-sufficient in the UK. So this is a cost of living issue for every household now. And for businesses in the food and beverage supply chain, it's a security of supply issue it's a procurement cost issue. And in some cases, it's the ability to bring to market their iconic products issue. So, that cuts right to the heart of creating solid foundations for businesses to operate. And I think that is ultimately the source of value for the food and beverage sector here.
I love hearing you describe it that way, because for me, resilience and the building of resilience in the face of risk is such a fundamental lever for change in industry. And we're in one of those situations where we need investors to change behavior, we need businesses to change behavior, we need people to change behavior. But as you say, it all works within a system. So we have to actually use those things which are an issue in the existing system to try and shake things out of the place where they are. And this idea that the consequences of failing to act are so visible and so dramatic is one of those things that says this is not something that's happening to somebody far away. This need for resilience is about the life you're living today and the life you want to live tomorrow. And I think that's an enormously powerful message. But what's interesting here, for me, is this very issue about how do you effect change within a system? So obviously, there will be more and more corporates entering this area, entering the regenerative space. Do they all understand what's going on? What is working and what isn't? Where are you seeing positive action within the markets, the benefits to farmers? And where do you see a misalignment of those benefits? Where can we actually take further action?
So I think the positives are that if you're at a certain stage in the value chain where you're what some people call a consumer packaged goods company, you're a well-known public brand whose consumer products end up in supermarkets around the world, you also represent a bit of a confluence point in value chains. And you tend to have a particular exposure to certain commodities, certain crops. So you act as a bit of a magnifying glass in that system. And that's where we as Soil Capital have seen, frankly, the money moving most significantly. And not just in a sort of one-off, transaction type of basis, but in a multi-annual contract kind of guise. Now, obviously what those businesses then face is how do they get their suppliers, which might be, 1, 2, even 3 layers before they get to farmers, and how do they get their supermarket clients to also engage and share the responsibility, the investment cost of improving the resilience in the system. And I think that's where we're at right now within the agri-food value chain more generally, is that a few big leading players are shouldering most of the currently voluntary burden, and are kind of looking around saying, all right, so others might have different business models in this system, but we all need to play our role for this to achieve the speed and the scale that's needed. Because let's be clear, what the world is currently doing today to rebuild soil health and to have resilient food and beverage systems pales into insignificance compared to the need. We've got lots of leading lights, but is it enough? Absolutely not.
Well, then I think that then begs the question, if we know that regenerative agriculture contributes to long-term food system security, we're basically talking about something which is a national security issue. It is a humanitarian issue. It is an economic system issue. We're facing these questions and the challenges being raised by climate instability and soil degradation and market volatility. What do we need to do? What can we change? What needs to happen?
Look, I think with any systems challenge, you do need the key actors, the key levers within that system to move with some form of concerted effort. So I think one of the things that we're spending more and more time on as Soil Capital is, having built up a decent amount of momentum from within the private sector, the agri-food value chain, how does that now give confidence and the space and the ideas to policymakers and regulators to deal with, their inevitable short-termism that they have to operate with as well? Because even for them, acting for the long term, for the system health is tricky. So even just yesterday, I was involved in a conversation between the agri-food value chain and the European Commission, where experiences and the willingness to invest from the private sector was creating openings on the policymaker side to say, well, maybe this should make us think differently about how we spend Europe's agricultural subsidies.
That would be amazing.
Easy to say, hard to do. Yeah, it really would be amazing. But when you're trying to change a system this way, you have to sort of be reassured by the steps that you're taking rather than necessarily the end goal being the only reward.
I think one of the things that comes up with that, because as I say, it does seem to be a global issue. It's a country level problem. And one of the challenges for that has always been the disconnect between the short-term horizon and the long-term horizon, let alone the medium one. But I think of things like the challenges around UPF and the health associations, and you can see direct impacts from poor nutrition or from poor soil in the physical health of the people. And in the UK, that directly correlates to NHS costs. So there are arguments to be made to regulators that bluntly, that improving the soil of health is an easy way to improve the quality of food. And obviously that has to happen everywhere because of our import systems. But I guess I can see that argument, and I can see that argument making sense to a policymaker. Now, the risk argument makes sense for corporates, but at the same time, they've got so many risks they're facing, they're having to prioritize them in whatever way is most immediate for them. What's interesting is where you can see resilience providing extra benefit. Do you have examples of that sort of thing, things we can talk about that show a business it's risk management, which is critically important, but it's also a huge opportunity to do things differently and benefit from doing things differently?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. It needs to be brought to life. Human beings, of course, are notoriously engaged by stories. I know we're doing this purely with our voices in audio, but there's a photo that we love to use, which maybe I can sort of paint a picture with my voice, and then listeners can see afterwards how well I've conjured up the image in their minds. Imagine two fields just a few hundred meters away from each other in France during the wet autumn last year, 2024. And on the left, imagine very soggy, wet fields with a tractor sunk up to half of its wheels into the mud, with equipment trailed behind it where it's trying to drill winter crops to grow over the winter. And effectively, that tractor is stuck. And if they try and go in with more tractors too quickly, they'll just get more tractors stuck. That field's out of action, and that crop may not get planted that season. And then on the right, picture a nearly identical tractor, as I say, just a few hundred meters away in the same part of France, performing operations in the field without any trouble at all. And clearly, there the farmer is in action, farming as he or she intends to farm. And the difference between the two is not the different amounts of water that have fallen on one or the other. It's the quality of the soil. Very simply, healthy soil, which means soil with higher amounts of organic matter, is structurally more like a sponge. There's more holes in it, more ability for water to infiltrate, and the soil can then hold more water afterwards, as a sponge would do. So when you have too little water, which is, as we're recording this, currently what's happening, that healthy soil is able to sustain plants longer through drought periods. This has a very tangible effect on what farmers call workability or travel, the ability to travel on the soil. And that's really brought to life by the sunken tractor on the one hand and the working tractor on the other. So stories work for some people, but data works for others. We've actually, we've been doing what we do now for long enough to be able to have decent sized data sets, to be able to crunch some numbers. And our data team at Soil Capital did some interesting early work on this last year. They took a region of France, the Charente region, and they split the farmers that we work with there into two broad buckets: those who'd been working to improve their soil health for longer, more regenerative farmers, and those who were earlier in their journey, so were likely to have more degraded soils. And that region was exposed to very clear observable drought events, at least 2, if not 3, over a couple of year period. And so we were able to look at the yields that were achieved by the regenerative farmers and the more early stage transition farmers. The more regenerative farmers showed 50% less yield volatility than the early transition farmers. And it's not it's a correlation, not a causation, but we know enough behind the scenes about what's going on there to be encouraged by that data that comes out. And that's something we're working on now to sort of replicate more widely, because for anyone that's interested in risk metrics, that starts to become quite interesting.
I think you make a very good point that narrative is important so that people understand what's going on, but you need the data underpinning it to make sense, because everybody understands the world in a different way, and you have to speak to people's understanding where they are. So I think that's amazingly powerful. And I also think it's fascinating listening to you talk about the importance of organic content in the soil, because I've been covering the Save Soil campaign for a number of years, which is this massive campaign to build up the organic content in soil because it holds water. That helps prevent against the impact of flooding. And it means that you have better, stronger, damper soil to survive, as you say, during drought. So that's actually very exciting to me because it connects really well. I think what I would like to ask now is, how does it work for the farmer? Because I can now see it on the system level. What do farmers have to do? What does it cost them, I guess? What do they do?
Well, the first part of the answer to that is there isn't an off-the-shelf, cookie-cutter, out-the-bag recipe. That way of thinking is what the modern industrial system we're currently in, where there's an off-the-shelf, out-of-the-packet answer to every known problem, if I'm being unkind. So context-specific design is the first answer to that. But fundamentally, the principles and the practices that farmers adopt to bring life back to their soil are all about being more nature-friendly and working more with nature. So photosynthesis is a huge part of this. Photosynthesis involves green plants converting sunlight and carbon dioxide into carbohydrates that are not just fuel for the plants, but are actually pushed out into the soil as sugars, and that should feed the life in the soil, the bacteria and fungi, if we weren't too busy dousing their environments in chemicals and turning them over with steel and breaking the fungal networks that connect different root systems under the surface. So with that bit of knowledge, bare soil, turning soil over, using excessive agrochemicals and synthetic fertilizers, which are also disrupting the life in the soil, are all parts of the system which we need to quieten down, while increasing practices like cover cropping, so that there is no bare soil, but instead we're growing in between cash crops that are continuing to photosynthesize and pump those sugars out to feed the microbes in the soil, reducing the intensity of tillage, even moving to no-till systems where that's appropriate, using much more diversity in the agri-ecosystem to combat and outcompete pests and weeds that are otherwise causing us to spray and to till. Integrating livestock back into arable systems. We have very specialized models of farming now where you can travel through bits of Europe's countryside and know that you're either in animal land or plant land. Back in the day, they coexisted, and for good reason. And if we can get more of that, so much the better. So, I'm touching on a variety of different principles and practices in perhaps not a super structured way, but this gives you a sense of the sorts of things that farmers are doing. And then the real art and science comes down to working out what makes sense for them in their context, in what order, in order to manage risk through that transition.
Now, one of the things that brings up is this line that goes around. What about what is said that regenerative farming, while it may minimize output volatility, lowers output?
I think our experience is it doesn't need to. I think like all things, or like many things in life, there are ways to do it badly. Certainly from our boots on the ground experience, we have seen around the world in different agricultural contexts that it's possible to maintain yields through a transition and then increase them. It's also possible to do the opposite, especially if you try and push that system too quickly through a transition. One of the things we need to maintain, despite the mounting crises we face and the urgency of them on both climate, nature, and frankly, farmer livelihoods and generational renewal and all of these intersecting topics, we need to maintain patience. If we force farmers through a transition too quickly, their systems will fall over and we will see those yield declines and we will suffer the consequences of that and possible rebound effects where we change our mind and think it wasn't a good idea in the first place. So I think we need to retain a bit of patience, because it's with, a sort of 5 to 10 year approach of transitioning a farm system rather than a 3-year approach that you give yourself more likelihood of building the base of soil health and natural fertility that's needed to sustain that kind of transition.
And that, to me, says something really useful about the way in which you look at change, because I've been following technological innovations in various sectors for many, many years. But when you get too focused on technology, there tends to be this expectation that you're going to have very significant, very rapid return. And if you're not getting that, you're out. And that's not necessarily the most helpful way to deal with challenges which actually fundamentally underpin the way in which we live. So, I think calling for patience in the face of attempting change is really, really important.
The other thing that patience just kind of brings up, though, of course, is, if you're operating within a market and political system that you depend on, you actually need that market and political system to have some form of long-term predictability and stability as well. So I think where my call for patience becomes practical is for those with influence in the food and beverage sector and the policy world to create stability in their system conditions, while also kind of obviously incentivizing and encouraging that change. But constantly changing the rules or the expectations every year or less does not sit well with a farmer mentality that needs to have a 5-10 year runway at this.
To be fair, it's not just farmers who want to have a 5 to 10 year runway.
No.
If you look at the technology world, there are many, many businesses which are significantly committing to cleaner approach to their economic activities, but they say themselves, but we need to know what the regulatory environment is going to be. We need to understand what the investment environment is going to be, because otherwise we cannot commit capital. And fundamentally, if you don't commit capital in a world that is dominated by this sort of neoliberal market view, you're not going to see any change. So that one drives me crazy. But I think that then leads me to a question. What is giving you the most optimism about the future of regenerative agriculture?
I think the optimism comes from the fact that, it can be very overwhelming to talk about a different system, needing a different system. System change is hard. But in this case, we're talking about a system that is already being demonstrated by thousands of farmers around the world who have found their own way to that new way of operating. They're showing that farming in a different way makes financial, environmental, and social sense, that it doesn't have to come with unacceptable compromise in terms of output. And when we look at those systems, very often they are delivering no regrets outcomes in the face of a world that faces multiple different possible futures. These systems are drawing carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it back in the soil, good for mitigating climate change. Those systems are at the same time making the soil more resilient to extremes of weather. So we're adapting those farms at the same time. Those systems are also restoring biodiversity and water cycles, much needed. And of course, renewing farmer engagement in their own profession and delivering more stable livelihoods. So it done in the right way, it feels hard to me to find scenarios where we would regret pushing agricultural systems to be more focused on these kinds of practices. So that gives me optimism. We can see it all happening, and it doesn't require us to make tricky trade-off choices between the many possible futures that we're looking at.
So, having discussed optimism, what needs to change? Because one of the challenges I see is that if you're getting the food and beverage industry to make payments to farmers for farming in a different way for the quality, this connects to this cost of living crisis and the inflationary pressures and the fact that nobody wants to pay more for anything. What do we do? How do we change what we need to change? Who needs to do what?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? And we could fill all of our remaining time on this. But I think one of the things that needs to change about even how you framed the question there is that we assume that this shift is going to be the option that costs us more. And I'm afraid the do nothing approach, continuing as we are, is the one that locks us into much more cost and suffering. And we're seeing that already. We talked earlier about extreme weather and a lack of resilience being the single biggest driver of food price inflation in the UK in 2023, I think, or 2022. So it's happening already, but the dominant narrative out there in the media and therefore, or not therefore, but in the media and in policy and business circles doesn't treat that as the business as usual null hypothesis. We're locked into that system. And so actually, what I'd love to see more of is a recognition that what we're actually talking about is a sort of invest to save logic compared to where we could be going. I think that's a relatively easy thing because that's just a change in how we talk to each other and how we think.
Also, can I be honest? That is literally what we're talking about with narrative and data. The narrative is wrong. The data proves it. that's what we need to present in order to change the way in which people do things.
Yeah. And to be fair, because I'm tuned into that kind of topic, I am seeing more and more English speaking headlines and news articles connecting climate extremes and cost of living, cost of food. It's just the bit in between isn't well understood, which is the transmission mechanism between them is a lack of resilience in our farms, which is because we have largely dead and degraded soils.
Well, that's a very clear message that I think needs to be out there with more clarity and for more people, not just people like me, not just sort of interested observers, but actually people understanding the impact on the price of the food that they're going to buy and the companies thinking about how they're actually going to continue to. And when I say sustainable, I mean sustainable in the fact that they're still going to be around, not just their practices.
Absolutely.
So that brings me to one of my favorite questions, but possibly one of my meanest, which is, what haven't we talked about? What haven't I asked you about that you think I should have done?
Good question. I think one aspect of this conversation which we haven't acknowledged is that we've talked about modern industrial farming, and that's not the only approach to farming that exists around the world. In fact, the dominant number of farmers around the world are small-scale subsistence farmers doing a lot of things right. And they're often in the global south, of course. That's one of the trends or concerns that I have is that the natural sort of evolution of things is for us in the West or the global North to try and export our models to the global South. And I think there's a danger there that we just push problems from one part of the world to another. So I think I would just acknowledge that the vast majority of the farmers in the world are actually in a different system and aren't necessarily the subject of everything we've just talked about. So I think maybe just to put that in perspective.
Yeah, and I recognise that that's a vital perspective to have because, as you say, the majority of farmers are smallholders and their ability to be resilient is literally the foundation on which everything else exists and doesn't get discussed in enough detail.
Yeah.
I think one of the areas where it's really challenging is when you're starting to try and understand how the changes we're facing are going to affect you in your life, in your work, in your investments, is it's really complex. And there are these different scales at which everything operates. And sometimes I think it can be a little overwhelming. So I think that perhaps will be the subject of another podcast interview. And today we have focused on modern industrialized agriculture and how we can actually transform that for a better and more resilient future.
I'll maybe just add one other thing we haven't talked about just before we close, which is we've talked a lot about system change from within the system in modern industrial farming. And I think there is an important potential intersection with something that's coming stage left, which is more at the technology, the intersection of different technologies. And I'm thinking there particularly in an agricultural context about the potential impact of something like precision fermentation, which with, sort of super abundant clean energy and AI and robotics behind it, it doesn't take much to understand how the manufacturing of protein molecules could become quite disruptive. I know there's plenty said and talked about here, but the angle that's kind of caught my attention, thanks to the team at Rethink X, is more around disruptions, for instance, in the dairy sector, where at least a third of milk that's produced globally is used as an ingredient in something else rather than as a finished product, and therefore is somewhat hidden from consumers and potentially therefore easier to substitute with something dramatically cheaper. Now, I'm not saying that will happen or, potentially should happen, but I'm saying this.
It's a really interesting approach now that you mention it, because obviously I've looked at precision fermentation and the creation of meat in the lab, and there have been huge challenges about price and scalability and mouthfeel and market appetite and investor nervousness and all of these different things. But when you're talking about the potential for replacing something within the supply chain that people don't necessarily have to look at, you open up huge opportunity for change.
Absolutely. And I think the knock-on impacts of that are what catches my attention. The Rethink X team, Tony Sieber and co would argue that taking out a third of demand for milk is enough to kill the dairy industry totally, irrespective of what the other 2/3 of demand wants. And were that to happen, obviously the land that is impacted by the dairy industry, not just for the cattle themselves, but for the production of their feed, is enormous. And so within the global agricultural system, that becomes a fairly seismic event, which may transpire in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, kind of a non-linear type of interventions. Just as another closing thought, I think that's kind of interesting to have on the radar as well.
Very definitely. And actually, the whole concept of nonlinear change is so fundamental to understanding how the climate works that the idea that we're looking at that in our industrial models is really important.
Absolutely.
And I have to say, you've given me a huge amount of food for thought. Pun not intended. And I really, really appreciate you joining us today. It's been utterly fascinating. And I look forward to hearing more about what Soil Capital does in the future.
Thanks so much for having me.
To our listeners, we'll be back soon.